Not going to church in England cost £20 a month, not £20 a year, and not a fine you paid once and forgot. £20 every month, for as long as you stayed away, charged against men whose entire estates, in many cases, brought in less than the bill did. This is the Gunpowder Plot told through that bill. Where the £20 came from, who actually paid it, what the crown did with the money, what happened when a new king suspended the fines and then asked for the arrears anyway, and what the law looked like after the cellar was searched. There is very little gunpowder in this and a great deal of accounting. The machinery began mildly, and it began with a shilling. The Act of Uniformity of 1509 required every subject to attend the parish church on Sundays and holy days, and set the penalty for absence at 1 shilling, collected by the churchwardens and handed to the poor of the parish. A shilling was real money to a labourer and nothing whatever to a gentleman. Then the shilling became £20. In 1581, Parliament passed an act to retain the Queen's Majesty's subjects in their due obedience, and it raised the penalty for staying away to £20 for every month of absence. The reason given was security. Rome had excommunicated Elizabeth 11 years earlier, and priests trained abroad were coming quietly into England. The arithmetic of that fine is the whole story. The month in the Act was a lunar month of 28 days, which gives 13 of them in a year. 13 months at £20 each is £260 a year, payable for as long as a household stayed away from a service it could not attend. Set that against what money was in the reign. A labouring man might earn £8 a year. The annual bill for missing church was therefore roughly 30 years of a labouring man's wages, charged again the following year and the year after that, with no end written into the Act. A fine of that size is not really a fine. It is a way of taking land, and in 1587 Parliament made that explicit. A second Act provided that where the £20 went unpaid, the Crown could seize 2/3 of the offender's lands and hold them until the arrears were cleared. The debt was cumulative. It did not die with the man who owed it. So the law did not imprison recusants for what they believed. It invoiced them. A man could keep his faith privately with a priest in the attic, and the state's interest in him was by then almost entirely financial. It wanted the £20, or it wanted the land standing behind the £20. And here is the question this whole story comes down to, so put your answer in the comments before you hear mine. Was that £20 a punishment, or was it a price? See whether you still think the same thing by the end. The men who eventually met at an inn off the Strand did not come from the whole body of English Catholics. They came from a narrow band of it, landed families, mostly in the Midlands, mostly related to each other by marriage, who had been paying that bill for a generation. Sir Thomas Tresham held Rushton in Northamptonshire, and he is the clearest case in England of what the law did to a man who refused to pretend. He was arrested in 1581, the first year of the new fine, and for the rest of his life he was in and out of custody, under bond, under sequestration, and above all, under assessment. Over some 25 years, he paid something like £8,000 in fines and forced payments. That is not a catastrophe that struck once. It is an annual charge met year after year by selling, mortgaging, and borrowing against an estate that had been meant to pass whole to his son. What makes Tresham unforgettable is what he did while it was happening. He built. At Rushton, he put up a small lodge built entirely in threes, 3 sides, 3 floors, 3 windows to a side, a building that states the doctrine of the Trinity in stone. A man being fined into the ground for his religion spent money he did not have on the monument to it. The practical question for such families was how to keep any land at all, and the answers were legal and ingenious. Estates were conveyed to Protestant relatives or friendly trustees who held them on paper while the recusant enjoyed them in fact. Leases were granted at nominal rents. Debts were arranged so that a friendly creditor stood ahead of the Crown. The Crown understood all of it. Commissions were appointed to find concealed lands. Informers were rewarded for exposing trusts, and the court spent years unpicking conveyances designed to look ordinary. The result was a permanent war of paperwork between the Exchequer and several hundred families, fought over deeds rather than doctrine. Then there is the detail that turns the system from a tax into something stranger. The Crown did not always collect these fines itself. It granted them away. A courtier who was owed a favor could be given the recusancy of a named gentleman, which meant the right to collect that man's £20 a month and keep it. That is the mechanism this episode is about. A private person could hold as a piece of property the income arising from his neighbor's religion. The grantee had every reason to want the man fined and no reason at all to want him converted, because a convert paid nothing and a recusant paid £260 a year. Robert Catesby was a Warwickshire gentleman of exactly this world, tall, well-liked, persuasive, and already known to the government. He had joined the Earl of Essex in his hopeless rising in London in '61, was taken and was not executed. He was fined instead, which tells you what the state wanted from men of his sort. He compounded for 3,000 marks, and to raise it he sold Chastleton, one of his properties. £2,000 in effect for one afternoon of rebellion. The lesson a man might take from it was not that the government was merciful. It was that the government had discovered his family was worth more solvent than dead. Thomas Percy collected rents in the north for his kinsman, the Earl of Northumberland, which made him a man who handled other people's money for a living and was chronically behind in accounting for it. He was also a late and fervent convert, and he had gone to Scotland before the old Queen died to seek assurances from the king who would follow her. Around them gathered the rest. Robert Wintour of Huddington and his brother Thomas, John Grant, Ambrose Rookwood, who kept fine horses, Sir Everard Digby, who was young and rich and had a house at Corton, and a professional soldier from Yorkshire serving in the Spanish army in the Low Countries who signed himself Guido Fawkes. Look at that list as an accountant would, and one pattern stands out. Almost every one of them was an heir. They were inheriting estates that had been carrying the £20 a month for 20 years, and they were inheriting the arrears with them. The bill was not something that had happened to their fathers, it was something being handed to them. Elizabeth died in March 1603, and the whole calculation appeared to change. James VI of Scotland came south to be James I of England, a king with a Catholic wife, a king who had corresponded politely with Catholic gentlemen, and a king known to want peace with Spain after nearly 20 years of war. For about a year, it worked. The fines were not pressed. Collections slackened, commissions went quiet, and recusant families began to behave like people who had come to the end of something. Some stopped setting aside the money. That last detail matters more than any speech made in the period. There were reasons of state behind the mildness, and they were not sentimental. James wanted the Spanish War finished, and the treaty was signed in London in 1604. A king, negotiating with the greatest Catholic power in Europe, had little use for a domestic campaign against Catholics while the ink was drying. But James also wanted money, and a king who wants money does not walk away from an existing revenue for long. Through 1604, the policy turned. A proclamation ordered priests out of the kingdom. The commission started up again. And the exchequer did the thing that made the reversal unforgivable to the men it fell on. It asked for the arrears. The suspension had never been a remission. It had been a pause in collection, and the £20 a month had gone on accruing through every month of it. So families who had spent a year believing the worst was over were handed a bill for the year in which they had believed it. If you want the moment that made a small group of men decide nothing could be got by waiting, it is that one. Not a martyrdom and not a sermon. A demand for money. Everybody had been quietly assured would not be asked for, arriving at houses that had already sold whatever could be sold. In May 1604, 5 men met at an inn called the Duck and Drake off the Strand and swore an oath on a primer. Catesby had the plan. The others agreed to it before they were told what it was, which is a measure of how far the ordinary arithmetic of their lives had stopped working for them. The plan itself was financed exactly as you would expect. Percy took a lease on a property adjoining the Palace of Westminster, using his position as a gentleman pensioner to make the tenancy look unremarkable. Rookwood provided horses. Digby pledged £1,500. Money that had been raised to pay fines went into the cellar instead. And into that undercroft, over the following months, went 36 barrels of gunpowder, covered with faggots and coal. The date kept moving, because Parliament kept being prorogued. First to February 1605, then to October, then to the 5th of November, and every delay meant more months of rent, more months of secrecy, and more men brought in to share the cost. Sir Thomas Tresham died in September 1605, 6 weeks before Parliament was due to sit, and the timing is the hinge of the entire story. The most heavily fined recusant in England died leaving an estate that had been drained for a quarter of a century and debts that had to be met by somebody. Francis Tresham inherited his father's estate, his father's arrears, and his father's creditors, all in the same month, and within days of the funeral, his cousin Catesby brought him into the plot and asked him for money. He gave some, hesitated, and argued for delay. He also had 2 brothers-in-law who would be sitting in the House of Lords. William Parker, Lord Monteagle, sat down to supper at Hoxton on the evening of the 26th of October and was handed a letter that had been given to a servant in the street by a man nobody could afterwards describe. He had it read aloud. It was unsigned and oddly worded, and it did not name anybody at all. The letter told him to devise some excuse to shift his attendance at this Parliament, because God and man had concurred to punish the wickedness of this time. Then came the sentence that has outlived every other document in the case. They shall receive a terrible blow, this Parliament, and yet they shall not see who hurts them. Robert Cecil, Earl of Salisbury, was the King's principal secretary, the most experienced intelligence manager in Europe, and a man with every reason to let a plot ripen rather than pick it early. He had the letter within hours. Nothing was done for 10 days. Then, on the 4th of November, a first search was made of the buildings around the house. That search found a great pile of firewood in an undercroft and a servant standing beside it, and it went away satisfied. A second search went back after midnight, moved the faggots, and found what was underneath. The man who had called himself John Johnson was taken with a lantern, a watch, and a quantity of slow match. The rest moved quickly. Catesby and the others rode west, tried to raise the Catholic gentry of the Midlands, and raised nobody, and were cornered at Holbech House in Staffordshire on the 8th of November, where the powder they had brought with them was soaked and they spread it before a fire to dry. It caught. Catesby and Percy were shot in the yard that followed. One thing before we go on, if you subscribe, it genuinely helps this channel keep going. And there is a new piece of British financial history every single day. The trial opened in Westminster Hall on the 27th of January 1606, and it was less an inquiry than a public accounting. The verdict was not in doubt. What the Crown wanted was a narrative fixed in the record, and it got one, delivered over several hours to a hall packed with spectators, including the King behind a screen. Sir Edward Coke, the Attorney General, led for the Crown, and his speech is a masterpiece of a particular kind. He set the plot in a long line of Catholic conspiracies going back 30 years, so that 7 or 8 indebted gentlemen became the visible end of a permanent foreign design, and every recusant in England was quietly placed at the same table. Then came the part of the law that made the case profitable. Conviction for treason carried attainder, and attainder did 2 things. It forfeited the traitor's lands and goods to the Crown, and it corrupted the blood, meaning his heirs could inherit nothing through him. The estates did not pass. They fell in. Huddington, Corton, and the rest were now Crown property to be granted, sold or leased, and they were. Digby's lands went to a Scottish courtier. Others were bought up by neighbours who had stayed conforming. A conspiracy hatched by men whose estates had been eaten by fines ended by transferring those estates entirely, which is the arithmetic the plot actually achieved. Henry Percy, the 9th Earl of Northumberland, was never charged with the plot, and no evidence was ever produced that he knew of it. His offence was that Thomas Percy was his kinsman and his rent collector, that he had made him a gentleman pensioner without administering the oath, and that he had dined with him shortly before the 5th of November. The Star Chamber fined him £30,000 and stripped him of his offices, and he was held in the Tower for 16 years. Only part of the fine was ever paid, and it was reduced later, but the sum entered on the record shows what the machinery could do when it was pointed at a rich man. Set it beside the fine. Everybody else was paying, and the shape of the thing is unmistakable. £30,000 is 115 years of the ordinary fine charged to one man in one afternoon on the basis of a dinner. The greatest sum extracted from the whole affair came from a man nobody accused of taking part in it. Parliament, meanwhile, was legislating. In 1606, it passed a fresh act against popish recusants, which did 2 things that mattered. It gave the Crown the choice of taking 2/3 of a recusant's lands in place of the £20 a month at its own election, and it imposed an oath of allegiance denying that the Pope could depose the King. The oath was the clever half. It split English Catholics precisely down the middle, because a man could swear it in good conscience or refuse it in good conscience, and the government could now distinguish between the two at no cost to itself. But the 2/3 clause was the half that made money, and it is the one worth following. By the end of the reign, the fines had settled into something nobody had designed and everybody relied on. The Crown rarely wanted the £20 a month, because a man cannot pay £260 a year for 30 years. What it wanted was a share of the land or a negotiated annual sum in place of the fine. That negotiated sum is the thing this whole story has been walking towards. Recusants began to compound, agreeing with the exchequer to pay a fixed amount each year and be left alone in return, not a penalty, a rate. Assessed on means, renewed periodically and treated by both sides as an ordinary and continuing item of household expenditure. Consider what that does to the purpose of the law. A penal statute is supposed to want its own extinction. If every recusant in England had conformed on the same Sunday, the Act of 1581 would have succeeded completely, and the revenue would have gone to nothing overnight. Success and yield pointed in opposite directions, and the Crown badly needed the yield. James spent heavily, and the ordinary revenue never covered him. The Great Contract of 1610, the attempt to trade the king's feudal rights for a settled annual income, collapsed in mutual distrust and left the finances where they had been, dependent on whatever streams could be found. Recusancy money was one of those streams, and it had a quality the exchequer prized above size. It was predictable. Compounded recusants paid a known figure at known dates. That is precisely the character of a license, and by the following reign, the Crown was farming the revenue out to syndicates who paid a lump sum for the right to collect it. At that point, the wheel comes full circle. The right to collect a man's fine for not attending church had become a tradable financial asset held by people with no interest in his soul and a direct interest in his continued absence. The law had acquired a constituency that needed it to fail. The honest counter-argument deserves to be put. The threat was not imaginary. Elizabeth had been excommunicated. Plots against her had been real. Spain had sent a fleet, and men had come into the country under orders from a foreign power. A government that took that seriously was not being hysterical, and the 5th of November proved that some of its fears had substance. But a law designed to end an offense behaves differently from one designed to charge for it. It falls hardest on those most likely to offend again, and it stops when they stop. This one fell hardest on those most able to pay, and left the poor recusant, who could not be worth collecting from, very largely alone. Enforcement followed money rather than danger. So the question the fine asks is not whether the men in the cellar were criminals. They were, and their own church condemned them. It is what the state was doing in the 25 years before, when it sent an annual bill to men it never charged with anything, and then granted the right to collect it to courtiers as a favor. The families themselves mostly survived, which is the last thing you would expect. The Treshams lost Rushton within 2 generations. The Voxes and the Throckmortons went on paying and compounding, and the recusancy rolls of the 1620s are full of the same surnames that appear on the rolls of the 1580s in the same counties at revised rates. That continuity is the proof of the argument. 2 generations of the heaviest financial pressure the English state could apply did not produce conversion. It produced a settled, priced, administered arrangement in which a family paid annually for a private exemption from a public duty, and both parties knew exactly what the transaction was. There is a final piece of evidence, and it is the one the fireworks have hidden. In the same session that produced the new penalties, the same Parliament passed one more act requiring every subject to attend church on the 5th of November each year to give thanks for the deliverance, enforced by the same parish officers who reported the absent. Look at what that means. The remedy for the plot was compulsory church attendance, policed by the identical machinery whose fines had helped make the plot. The state's answer to a conspiracy, caused in part by charging men for staying away from church, was to create one more day on which staying away could be charged for. It stayed on the statute book until 1859, long after the fines had gone and the last of the compounders were dead. By the time it was repealed, the 5th of November was bonfires and children, and almost nobody remembered that it had begun as an attendance requirement with a penalty attached. So, put the answer down now. £20 a month, 13 months a year, granted away to courtiers as an income, suspended by a new king, and then charged in arrears, and finally settled into a fixed annual rate that both sides renewed without embarrassment. Punishment or price. Nothing in it was unlawful, and that is exactly what makes it worth deciding.